This is the story of the Empire of Brazil, a nation born not from revolution, but from negotiation. A monarchy that coexisted with the age of republics. A country that transitioned from colony to empire, from empire to republic, all within the span of less than 100 years. The story of the Empire of Brazil is not only about emperors and laws. It is about how a nation forged its identity through negotiation, conflict, and change. It is about how history shaped Brazil and how Brazil shaped history. Let us begin. Brazil's journey to empire begins long before independence. To understand the foundations of the Empire of Brazil, we must first look back to the Age of Discovery, when European powers were dividing the world between them. In the year 1500, the Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on the shores of what is now Brazil. This accidental landfall became the cornerstone of Portugal's largest and most distant colony. Over the next 3 centuries, the land would be transformed by waves of colonization, forced labor, cultural exchange, and conflict. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Brazil developed as an economic outpost of the Portuguese Empire. The early colonial economy revolved around sugar plantations along the northeastern coast. To work the plantations, the Portuguese relied heavily on the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil, making it one of the largest slave societies in the world. At the same time, the indigenous peoples of Brazil were displaced, enslaved, or absorbed into colonial society. The wealth produced by sugar, later supplemented by gold and diamonds discovered in the late 1700s, was extracted and sent to Europe. Portugal's imperial focus was on resource extraction rather than long-term development. Administration was limited and local autonomy grew, especially in Brazil's vast interior regions. By the 18th century, Brazil had become the jewel of the Portuguese colonial system. The discovery of gold in Minas Gerais in the 1700s drew tens of thousands of settlers. Entire towns sprang up in the interior, such as Ouro Preto and Mariana. The gold rush brought not only wealth, but also new institutions, roads, and a growing sense of Brazilian identity distinct from Portugal. However, this prosperity came with rising tensions. The Portuguese crown imposed heavy taxes on gold production, which fueled resentment among colonists. One of the earliest signs of organized resistance was the Inconfidência Mineira in 1789. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Revolution, a group of intellectuals and military officers plotted to create an independent republic in Minas Gerais. Their plan failed, and the leaders were arrested. Among them was Joaquim José de Silva Xavier, known as Tiradentes. He was executed and later became a national symbol of independence. Though unsuccessful, the Inconfidência Mineira revealed the growing dissatisfaction with Portuguese rule. Meanwhile, events in Europe would soon alter the course of Brazil's history. In the early 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars engulfed the continent. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered the invasion of Portugal after it refused to join his continental blockade against Britain. The Portuguese royal family, the House of Braganza, faced a crisis. Rather than surrender or face capture, they made a dramatic decision, one without precedent in European colonial history. In December of 1807, under British naval protection, Prince Regent João, later King João VI, led the entire Portuguese royal court, thousands of nobles, ministers, servants, and their families, across the Atlantic to Brazil. The fleet of over 30 ships carried the monarchy from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro, which would now become the new center of the Portuguese Empire. When the court arrived in Rio in early 1808, it was a shock to the colonial world. Never before had a European monarch relocated the seat of government to a colony. The arrival of the court transformed Rio de Janeiro overnight. Streets were widened, public buildings were established, and institutions of higher learning were created. In effect, Brazil was no longer just a colony. It was now the de facto capital of the Portuguese Empire. This shift had immediate and long-lasting consequences. Economically, Brazil opened its ports to friendly nations, particularly Britain, breaking the colonial trade monopoly that had previously restricted commerce. This stimulated economic growth and increased Brazil's integration into the global market. Culturally and administratively, the presence of the royal court brought new institutions: a national library, botanical gardens, the royal press, and new ministries were created. The legal and political structure of Brazil became more complex, with a growing bureaucratic class and legal professionals. Education and intellectual life began to expand, particularly in Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and Recife. The presence of the monarchy also elevated Brazil's political status. In 1815, as part of the Congress of Vienna's post-Napoleonic realignment, Brazil was formally elevated from colony to co-equal kingdom within the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. For the first time, Brazil was recognized not just as a distant territory, but as a central part of a broader imperial system. This was a symbolic but crucial step toward future independence. Still, these changes did not resolve underlying tensions. Many Portuguese elites resented the shift in power away from Lisbon. At the same time, Brazilian-born elites, or criollos, began to see themselves as the natural leaders of a rising nation. The idea that Brazil could govern itself, no longer under colonial control but under its own authority, was spreading. The movement of the court to Brazil also created a unique set of circumstances. A European monarchy residing in the Americas, developing institutions and practices within the colony rather than ruling from afar. This situation would set the stage for an unusual kind of independence, one led not by revolutionaries overthrowing a foreign crown, but by members of the royal family themselves. As Napoleon was defeated and the political order of Europe was being restored, pressure mounted for the Portuguese royal family to return home. By 1821, King João VI would make the decision to sail back to Lisbon, leaving his son, Dom Pedro, behind in Brazil as regent. But by then, the relationship between Portugal and Brazil had already changed forever. When the Portuguese royal court arrived in Brazil in the early months of 1808, they brought more than just furniture, archives, and nobles. They brought with them the central government of the Portuguese Empire. Rio de Janeiro, once a colonial port city, was suddenly the new seat of a European monarchy. This change would permanently alter Brazil's political identity and reshape its relationship with Portugal. In the years that followed the arrival of Prince Regent João and his court, Brazil experienced a wave of institutional development that had no precedent in colonial Latin America. These years would see the rapid establishment of courts, ministries, libraries, and schools. The machinery of state, usually confined to the metropole, was now operating in the Americas. Brazilian cities, particularly Rio de Janeiro, became centers of political activity, administration, and diplomacy. The opening of Brazil's ports to friendly nations in early 1808 marked a key moment. It ended the colonial trade restrictions that had, for centuries, limited Brazil's ability to buy and sell goods beyond Portuguese merchants. The move was primarily a diplomatic favor to Britain, whose navy had protected the royal court during its Atlantic crossing. In return, Britain gained access to Brazilian markets and helped secure Portugal's independence from Napoleonic domination. But the economic impact on Brazil was transformative. Trade expanded, British manufactured goods flooded Brazilian markets, and local economic elites grew in both power and ambition. Culturally and politically, Brazil began to shift from a peripheral colony to a center of imperial gravity. The presence of the monarchy gave legitimacy to institutions that would otherwise have remained symbolic or marginal. The royal press was founded, enabling the publication of newspapers and legal documents. The first Brazilian law schools would emerge soon after. The National Library, based on the royal archives brought from Lisbon, became a symbol of learning and knowledge. These changes empowered a class of educated Brazilian-born elites who began to see themselves not merely as colonials, but as citizens of a kingdom. In 1815, this transformation was formalized. As Napoleon's influence in Europe declined and Portugal sought to reassert its authority on the global stage, Prince Regent João elevated Brazil to the status of a kingdom. The new political entity, the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, was declared. Brazil was now no longer officially a colony. On paper, it stood as an equal partner in a united realm. This elevation had symbolic and strategic value. It affirmed the reality that the monarchy now ruled from Brazil, not from Lisbon. It also served to calm growing dissatisfaction among Brazilian elites who wanted greater recognition of their country's growing importance. But despite its promising title, the United Kingdom remained highly centralized under royal authority. Portuguese interests still dominated in key areas, particularly finance, foreign affairs, and the upper levels of administration. João, now King João VI, faced mounting pressure. On the one hand, Brazilian elites were growing more assertive, expecting that Brazil's new status would lead to more autonomy and representation. On the other hand, Portuguese elites in Lisbon resented the shift in imperial focus to Brazil. They wanted the king to return and restore Lisbon's primacy. The tension between the two sides grew more visible as the years went on. These political currents came to a head in 1820. Across Europe, liberal revolutions were demanding constitutional government and curbing the powers of monarchies. In Portugal, the liberal revolution of Porto broke out. Portuguese revolutionaries demanded the return of the king and the restoration of the Cortes, the Portuguese Legislative Assembly, which had not convened since the early 18th century. Faced with growing liberal pressure and unrest in Portugal, King João VI agreed to return to Lisbon in early 1821. But this decision created a new problem. Who would govern Brazil in his absence? The king appointed his son, Dom Pedro, as Prince Regent of Brazil. Dom Pedro had been raised in Rio de Janeiro and had spent his formative years in Brazil rather than in Europe. He was young, energetic, and popular among both Brazilian elites and segments of the military. But his position was precarious. The Portuguese Cortes, now reassembled in Lisbon, began issuing decrees that sought to reduce Brazil's autonomy. These included orders to dismantle many of the institutions created since 1808 and to return Brazil to colonial administrative status. These actions alarmed many Brazilian elites who had come to enjoy the expanded privileges and institutions of the past decade. Lawyers, merchants, military officers, and provincial leaders feared that their influence would be rolled back. Tensions mounted between the Brazilian provinces and the Cortes in Lisbon. A clear split was emerging. The Portuguese wanted to reassert centralized control, while Brazilians wanted to preserve the autonomy gained since the royal court's arrival. At the heart of this crisis stood Dom Pedro. The young regent was caught between conflicting loyalties to his father and the crown in Lisbon and to the Brazilian people who increasingly saw him as their defender. For the moment, Dom Pedro attempted to navigate a middle course. He complied with some orders from the Cortes while resisting others, all the while consulting with local advisors and political figures. Among those figures was José Bonifácio de Andrada e Silva, a respected scholar and politician from São Paulo. Bonifácio would soon become one of the key architects of Brazilian independence. He understood the stakes. If Brazil accepted the Cortes' demands, it would mean the dismantling of its recent progress. If it resisted, it risked open conflict. Bonifácio and other advisors encouraged Dom Pedro to stand firm against Lisbon. By the end of 1821, the situation had become increasingly unstable. Brazilian provinces were asserting their right to self-governance. Calls for a national assembly were spreading. And Dom Pedro's role as regent was evolving from that of a royal delegate to that of a potential sovereign leader. The decisions he would make in the following months would determine the course of Brazilian history. By the beginning of 1821, Brazil stood at a crossroads. Over the past 13 years, it had evolved from a Portuguese colony into the residence of a European monarchy and a co-equal part of the Portuguese Empire. But with King João VI now back in Lisbon and the Portuguese Cortes aggressively attempting to reassert authority, the delicate balance between the mother country and its American kingdom was coming undone. At the center of this crisis stood Dom Pedro, the young prince regent of Brazil. Having remained in Rio de Janeiro while his father returned to Portugal, he was expected to act as a bridge between the two realms. But he was also increasingly seen by Brazilians as their representative and potential leader in the face of growing centralization from Lisbon. The Portuguese Cortes, re-established in 1820, had begun to issue decrees that undermined Brazil's autonomy. Among their first actions was an order for Dom Pedro to return immediately to Lisbon. They demanded the dismantling of key Brazilian institutions, the resubordination of provincial governments to Lisbon's authority, and the re-establishment of colonial administrative structures. In short, they were attempting to reverse the political developments made since the royal court's relocation to Brazil in 1808. These efforts were not simply bureaucratic. They carried deep symbolic and practical consequences. Brazilian elites, merchants, lawyers, landowners, and military officers had grown used to managing their own affairs. Many had profited and advanced socially under the more autonomous conditions. Now, they faced a future in which their influence would be diminished, and decisions once again made across the ocean by representatives with little understanding of Brazil's realities. Opposition grew swiftly. In cities such as São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Salvador, newspapers criticized the Cortes decrees. Provincial assemblies began asserting their own authority. Petitions were sent to Dom Pedro urging him to resist. Across the empire, there was an emerging sense that the future of Brazil must be decided within Brazil. Dom Pedro, only in his mid-20s, was now under immense pressure. On one side were his obligations to the Portuguese crown and the Cortes. On the other were the voices of Brazilian leaders and common people alike, urging him to defend the nation's growing autonomy. He also understood that his own political future might not lie in Portugal, but in Brazil, where he was increasingly treated as a potential monarch in his own right. Among his closest advisors during this time was José Bonifácio de Andrada e Silva, the São Paulo-born scholar and statesman. Bonifácio had studied in Europe, was deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought, and had returned to Brazil with a firm belief in constitutional government. He became Dom Pedro's chief minister in early 1822, and his counsel proved decisive. Bonifácio argued that Brazil should not submit to the Cortes, and that any return to colonial status would undo the progress of the last decade. He envisioned an independent Brazil governed as a constitutional monarchy under Dom Pedro's leadership. Bonifácio's influence, along with mounting public support, led to the first major turning point in the independence process, the Dia do Fico, or I Will Stay Day. On January 9, 1822, Dom Pedro made a public declaration that he would remain in Brazil. The phrase he reportedly used was, "If it is for the good of all and the general happiness of the nation, I am ready. Tell the people that I will stay." This moment galvanized the independence movement. The prince had sided with Brazil. In the months that followed, Dom Pedro and Bonifácio moved quickly. They began replacing Portuguese-born officials with Brazilian-born appointees. The Brazilian military was reorganized to ensure loyalty to the regent. In May of that year, a constituent assembly was summoned to begin drafting a Brazilian constitution. But tensions with Portugal continued to rise. The Cortes refused to recognize any of these actions as legitimate. They issued further orders for Dom Pedro's removal and declared that any Brazilian defiance would be treated as rebellion. Communication between Lisbon and Rio became increasingly hostile. The possibility of armed conflict grew. Dom Pedro responded by traveling to various Brazilian provinces to rally support. His most important trip came in August of 1822, when he visited São Paulo. There, he was met with strong backing from local leaders, including many who had supported the earlier push for autonomy. While returning from São Paulo in early September, Dom Pedro received letters from Lisbon that made clear the Cortes would not compromise. They had annulled the acts of his government and demanded that he submit fully to their authority. According to several historical accounts, it was at this point, on the banks of the Ipiranga River near São Paulo, that Dom Pedro made the final decision. He declared Brazil's independence from Portugal. Though this defining moment would be formally marked in the next chapter, the foundations were laid throughout the year 1822. What had begun as a political balancing act turned into a national movement. The Prince Regent, influenced by advisors and public opinion, had moved from cautious mediation to open leadership of a new political order. The events of 1821 and 1822 also revealed broader dynamics at play. Brazil's path to independence was shaped not by a mass popular uprising, as in many Spanish colonies, but through elite negotiation and royal authority. Dom Pedro's position as a member of the royal family gave the movement legitimacy in the eyes of many. His alliance with Bonifacio and other moderate reformers helped avoid the kind of internal chaos seen elsewhere in Latin America. Still, the stakes were high. Independence was not yet guaranteed. The provinces were not all unified. Armed conflict with Portugal was still possible, and no clear constitution had yet been agreed upon. But the tide had turned. Brazil was on the verge of declaring itself a sovereign empire, led by a monarch who had chosen to remain. On a dusty road near the Ipiranga River, outside the city of São Paulo, a defining moment in Brazilian history unfolded. It was September 7th in the year 1822. Prince Dom Pedro, no longer merely a regent of the Portuguese crown, proclaimed Brazil's independence with a short but thunderous declaration, "Independence or death." That moment, later memorialized in countless paintings, textbooks, and public monuments, marked the formal birth of the Empire of Brazil. But the reality behind it was more complex than a single cry. It was the culmination of months of political tension, institutional change, and public mobilization, and it signaled the beginning of a new and uncertain era. The journey to that moment had accelerated after Dom Pedro's decision to remain in Brazil in January of that same year, against the wishes of the Portuguese Cortes. Since then, his relationship with Lisbon had steadily deteriorated. By the time he received the final letters from the Cortes during his journey back from São Paulo in early September, the situation had become irreconcilable. Those letters, sent from Lisbon, reaffirmed that the Cortes did not recognize any of Dom Pedro's authority in Brazil. They demanded his return, declared his government illegitimate, and ordered that Brazilian provinces be brought back under direct Portuguese control. These commands made it clear that negotiation had failed. There would be no shared kingdom, no compromise. For Brazil to preserve its autonomy, it would need to sever ties entirely. Dom Pedro, traveling with a small entourage, read the letters on the banks of the Ipiranga River. According to reports from those present, including the historian and aide-de-camp José Bonifacio's brother, Dom Pedro tore the Portuguese insignia from his uniform, drew his sword, and declared Brazil independent. Though the famous phrase, "independence or death," may have been added emphasis in later retellings, there is little doubt that this was the turning point. Following this act, Dom Pedro immediately sent word to Rio de Janeiro and other provincial capitals. On September 22nd, he issued a manifesto to the Brazilian people, justifying the declaration and calling for unity. In it, he framed independence not as rebellion, but as a necessary act of preservation, a way to protect Brazil from colonial regression and arbitrary rule. The response across Brazil varied. In many urban centers, especially in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais, the declaration was welcomed with celebrations and public demonstrations. Among the landowning elite and professional classes, independence under Dom Pedro's rule was seen as a way to preserve stability while avoiding the chaos and fragmentation that had occurred in Spanish America. In the Northeast and in some parts of the South, however, loyalty to the Portuguese crown remained strong. Cities like Salvador in Bahia and Belém in Pará remained under Portuguese control for months after the declaration. In these areas, Portuguese garrisons and loyalist militias resisted the new imperial authority. This meant that independence, though symbolically declared, still needed to be secured through military means. The war for Brazilian independence, though not as widespread or prolonged as the conflicts seen in Spanish America, was real and costly. Battles took place in Bahia, Maranhão, Pará, and parts of the Cisplatin region. In Bahia, the conflict was particularly intense. Portuguese forces held the capital city of Salvador, while Brazilian independence forces, composed of local militias and soldiers from other provinces, laid siege to the city. With support from a growing naval force, Brazil eventually forced Portuguese troops to evacuate in July of 1823. The role of the Brazilian Navy was critical during these campaigns. Built rapidly with the assistance of foreign officers, most notably Thomas Cochrane, a British-born admiral who had previously fought for Chilean and Peruvian independence, the Navy helped cut off Portuguese reinforcements and supplies. Cochrane's capture of Maranhão and Pará in the north brought those provinces into the Brazilian fold and demonstrated the strategic importance of naval power. While the military campaigns unfolded, Dom Pedro's political role began to shift. On October 12, 1822, he was formally acclaimed as Emperor of Brazil. The coronation took place in Rio de Janeiro, and he took the title Dom Pedro the First. The decision to form a constitutional monarchy, rather than a republic, was intentional. It allowed for continuity, especially among elites who feared radical social changes. It also emphasized legitimacy, connecting the new empire with the royal traditions of Europe while asserting a distinct Brazilian identity. Dom Pedro I's early imperial rule focused on consolidating national unity, asserting authority over rebellious provinces, and managing relations with foreign powers. Recognition of independence from other nations was not immediate. The United States was among the first to recognize Brazil in 1824, consistent with its Monroe Doctrine and support for anti-colonial movements. However, European powers, including Britain and France, delayed recognition until diplomatic arrangements and compensation to Portugal could be negotiated. Portugal itself did not recognize Brazil's independence until 1825. The agreement came with the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro, under which Portugal formally relinquished claims to Brazil in exchange for financial compensation. King João VI retained the honorary title of Emperor of Brazil, though without authority, as a symbolic concession. The treaty, while largely symbolic for Portugal, gave Brazil the international legitimacy it needed to operate as a sovereign nation. Internally, the new empire faced challenges. The provinces were diverse, with different economic structures, political interests, and degrees of loyalty to the crown. Dom Pedro's task was to unify them under a single imperial government while managing the demands of autonomy and representation. This would soon lead to conflict over the constitution, a matter left unresolved in the initial months following independence. Nonetheless, the events of September 7th and their aftermath marked a foundational shift. Brazil had become a sovereign empire, the only independent monarchy in the Americas. Its path to independence had been shaped not by revolution from below, but by elite negotiation, royal decision-making, and targeted military action. The continuity of monarchy, rather than the establishment of a republic, set Brazil apart from its neighbors. For Dom Pedro I, independence was both a personal and political turning point. He had defied the Portuguese Cortes, rejected Lisbon's authority, and embraced a Brazilian identity that many around him believed in deeply. Yet, the empire he now ruled was not yet fully stable. Regional divisions, constitutional debates, and power struggles would soon test the unity that independence had promised. The Empire of Brazil had been born, but the task of governing a vast and diverse land was only beginning. After declaring independence and being crowned emperor in late 1822, Dom Pedro I found himself in a fragile position. His authority was not absolute, his popularity uneven, and the institutions of the new empire still under construction. The next decade of his rule would be defined by efforts to consolidate power, manage internal dissent, and navigate a contentious political landscape. One of the first challenges Dom Pedro faced was drafting and enforcing a national constitution. Brazil's independence had been declared under the promise of establishing a constitutional monarchy, but what that meant in practice was still uncertain. Political factions began to emerge, some advocating for a liberal and decentralized framework, others supporting a strong central government under imperial authority. In the early months of 1823, a constituent assembly was convened in Rio de Janeiro to draft Brazil's first constitution. The assembly included delegates from several provinces and reflected the varied interests of Brazil's elites. Among them were lawyers, planters, and former royalists, all with different visions for the empire's future. Tensions quickly arose between the emperor and the assembly. Many delegates were wary of absolute rule and sought to limit the powers of the crown. They advocated for strong provincial rights, legislative supremacy, and checks on imperial authority. Dom Pedro, however, believed that a strong emperor was necessary to maintain unity and avoid fragmentation. His experiences in Portuguese politics, along with advice from conservative ministers, reinforced his belief that too much decentralization would lead to chaos. The debates in the assembly became increasingly heated. By mid-year, relations between Dom Pedro and the body had deteriorated. Accusations flew on both sides, of authoritarianism from the emperor and of republicanism from the deputies. In November of 1823, Dom Pedro dissolved the assembly by force, using the army to remove the delegates from the building. This action, known as the Night of Agony, shocked many Brazilians and deepened political divides. Following the dissolution, Dom Pedro appointed a Council of State to draft a constitution unilaterally. The resulting document, promulgated in March of 1824, established a constitutional monarchy but gave the emperor significant powers. Among the most controversial features was the moderating power, a unique Brazilian institution that granted the emperor authority to resolve disputes between branches of government and intervene in political matters. While framed as a neutral tool to maintain balance, in practice, it gave the monarch wide-ranging influence. The 1824 Constitution did create a bicameral legislature, consisting of a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies, and enshrined certain civil rights. But it left ultimate authority in the hands of the emperor. The document would remain in effect for the remainder of the empire, shaping Brazil's political development for decades. Resistance to the new constitution and imperial centralization came swiftly. In the northeastern province of Pernambuco, a major revolt broke out in April of 1824. Known as the Confederation of the Equator, this movement brought together liberal leaders, discontented elites, and former Republicans who opposed the concentration of power in Rio de Janeiro. They declared independence and sought to establish a republic, with support from several neighboring provinces. Dom Pedro responded with military force. The Imperial Army and Navy, led in part by Admiral Thomas Cochrane, moved to suppress the rebellion. After several months of fighting, the revolt was crushed by the end of the year. Its leaders were executed or exiled, and imperial control over the region was restored. Though the empire had survived its first major challenge, the episode revealed the fragility of national unity and the limits of imperial consensus. Meanwhile, Dom Pedro faced difficulties abroad. Brazil's independence had not come without territorial disputes. The Cisplatin province, modern-day Uruguay, had been part of the Portuguese and later Brazilian Empire, but its loyalty was contested. In 1825, a rebellion erupted in the province, supported by the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, the precursor to modern Argentina. What followed was the Cisplatin War, a conflict between Brazil and the United Provinces over control of the region. The war, fought mostly along the southern borders and at sea, dragged on for more than 2 years. It placed significant strain on Brazil's finances and military. The conflict ended inconclusively in 1828 with the Treaty of Montevideo, brokered by Britain. The Cisplatin province was recognized as the independent nation of Uruguay, a compromise that satisfied neither side but ended a costly and unpopular war. Dom Pedro's foreign policy took another unexpected turn in 1826 when his father, King João VI of Portugal, died. As the eldest son, Dom Pedro became the legal heir to the Portuguese throne. For a brief time, he was simultaneously Emperor of Brazil and King of Portugal, an awkward and politically dangerous situation. To resolve the dilemma, he abdicated the Portuguese crown in favor of his young daughter, Maria II, under the condition that Portugal adopt a constitutional charter. This decision, though diplomatically necessary, further complicated his political standing in Brazil. Back home, Dom Pedro's popularity continued to erode. The costs of the Cisplatin War had weakened the economy. Inflation rose and government revenues declined. Public frustration mounted, particularly among urban populations and sections of the elite who had expected a more liberal and responsive government. His autocratic style, clashes with the press, and suspicion of dissent alienated many former supporters. By 1829, political opposition had become more organized. Newspapers in cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo criticized the emperor's policies. Liberal politicians began calling for greater legislative power and limits on the moderating power. Dom Pedro's Portuguese advisors, whom many Brazilians viewed with suspicion, were blamed for deepening divisions. The final blow came in early 1831. Protests erupted in Rio de Janeiro over the emperor's handling of public unrest and his continued association with Portuguese officials. Demonstrations spread, and the military began to withdraw support. Fearing civil war and facing widespread opposition, Dom Pedro decided to abdicate. On April 7, 1831, he formally abdicated the throne in favor of his 5-year-old son, Dom Pedro the Second. The decision marked the end of the first reign of Brazil's imperial history. Dom Pedro the First left Brazil for Europe, where he would later become involved in Portuguese politics and fight to secure his daughter's throne. When Dom Pedro the First abdicated in April of 1831, Brazil was thrust into an unprecedented political experiment. The empire remained, but its emperor was now a 5-year-old child. With no adult monarch to govern, a regency was established. A transitional period meant to preserve the imperial system until young Dom Pedro II came of age. In theory, this arrangement was meant to ensure continuity. In practice, it exposed the fragile foundations of the Brazilian Empire. Over the next 9 years, Brazil would experience waves of instability, regional revolts, and shifting political alliances. The Regency period was one of the most turbulent chapters in Brazilian history, revealing deep divisions within the empire and raising questions about its very survival. The initial regency, known as the Provisional Triumviral Regency, was composed of 3 senior statesmen appointed immediately after the abdication. Their role was to stabilize the situation and organize a more permanent regency. Within a few months, the permanent Triumviral Regency took office, consisting of representatives from different political backgrounds. But from the outset, the regents struggled to maintain unity. One major challenge was the absence of a strong central figure. While the emperor had previously held the moderating power and acted as a balancing force, the regency lacked that authority. Decision-making became fragmented, and the central government often appeared weak and indecisive. Competing factions in the Chamber of Deputies and Senate further complicated governance. At the heart of these tensions were 2 competing visions for Brazil's future. On one side were the liberals, who favored decentralization, provincial autonomy, and more popular participation in government. On the other side stood the conservatives, who feared disorder and believed in a strong central authority to preserve the empire. These divisions often split along regional lines, with different provinces supporting different policies based on their local interests. In an attempt to address some of these concerns, the Regency implemented administrative reforms. The most significant was the Additional Act of 1834, a constitutional amendment that expanded provincial autonomy. Under the act, provincial governments gained more control over local administration, finance, and policing. Provincial legislative assemblies were given greater authority to pass laws and manage budgets. While intended to placate liberal demands, the Additional Act had unintended consequences. In many provinces, local elites used their newfound powers to consolidate control, often at the expense of imperial unity. In others, long-standing grievances erupted into open rebellion. Between 1835 and 1839, Brazil experienced a series of regional revolts that threatened to fragment the empire. The most serious of these occurred in the northern province of Grão-Pará and the southern province of Rio Grande do Sul. In Grão-Pará, the Cabanagem Revolt broke out in 1835. It was one of the few revolts in Brazilian history in which large segments of the poor and indigenous populations participated alongside provincial elites. The rebellion was driven by opposition to the central government's neglect, local political rivalries, and deep economic inequality. For a brief time, rebels seized control of the provincial capital, Belém, and attempted to establish a more inclusive government. However, the central government responded with force. By 1840, the revolt had been crushed, leaving tens of thousands dead and the province devastated. In the south, the Farroupilha War, or Ragamuffin War, began in Rio Grande do Sul in 1835. This conflict was rooted in economic disputes over taxes on charque, or dried meat, which was the region's primary export. Local ranchers, angered by what they saw as unfair trade policies and lack of representation, took up arms against the imperial government. The rebels declared an independent republic, the Rio Grandense Republic, and later extended their rebellion into neighboring Santa Catarina. Unlike other revolts, the Farroupilha War became a prolonged conflict, lasting nearly a decade. Rebel forces were well organized, and their leaders included seasoned military commanders. Though they never posed an existential threat to the empire as a whole, their persistence forced the central government to devote significant resources and attention to the southern frontier. Other notable revolts during the Regency included the Sabinada in Bahia and the Balaiada in Maranhão. The Sabinada, occurring between 1837 and 1838, was led by middle-class professionals in Salvador who opposed the Regency and demanded local reforms. They briefly established an autonomous government but were quickly defeated. The Balaiada, which erupted in 1838, was a social revolt involving peasants and runaway slaves demanding justice and land reform. It too was violently suppressed. These uprisings exposed the empire's vulnerabilities. The Regency's lack of legitimacy, the uneven distribution of power, and persistent regional inequalities made national cohesion difficult. Many Brazilians questioned whether the empire could survive, and some began advocating for a republic or federation as an alternative. In response to this mounting crisis, political leaders in Rio de Janeiro began to seek a solution. The idea of bringing Dom Pedro II to power early, before he had reached the legal age of majority, gained momentum. Supporters argued that a reigning emperor could restore order and serve as a symbol of national unity. This movement, known as the Majority Campaign, was supported by both conservatives and moderate liberals who feared the growing instability. By 1840, Dom Pedro II was 14 years old. Though still a child, he had been carefully educated and groomed for leadership. Public ceremonies, press campaigns, and regional petitions all called for his early accession to the throne. The final decision was made in July of 1840. On July 23rd, in a solemn ceremony at the Imperial Palace, the Senate formally declared Dom Pedro II of age. With that act, the Regency ended, and Brazil once again had an emperor. When Dom Pedro II was declared of age in July of 1840, Brazil was a nation in search of stability. After nearly a decade of regency marked by rebellion, decentralization, and political uncertainty, Brazilians across the empire hoped that the young emperor could restore unity and order. At just 14 years old, Dom Pedro II became the new symbol of national legitimacy, a unifying figure who could bridge regional divides and re-establish confidence in imperial governance. The challenges he inherited were enormous. Brazil was still reeling from multiple internal revolts. Provinces like Rio Grande do Sul and Maranhão had been theaters of prolonged and violent uprisings. The imperial treasury was strained. The political class was fragmented, and trust in central authority had been severely damaged during the Regency years. Yet despite his youth, Dom Pedro II approached the throne with remarkable composure and diligence. His early education had been rigorous, overseen by prominent Brazilian intellectuals and statesmen. He was trained in multiple languages, classical literature, philosophy, history, and law. But perhaps most importantly, he had been taught the value of moderation, duty, and public service, qualities that would come to define his long reign. In the years following his ascension, the emperor worked closely with experienced politicians to restore stability. Among his early allies were members of the Conservative Party, who sought to reassert central authority and reverse some of the decentralizing reforms of the Regency period. With their support, Dom Pedro endorsed a series of legal and administrative measures aimed at re-centralizing power in Rio de Janeiro. One of the most significant steps was the revision of the Additional Act of 1834. While that act had granted extensive autonomy to provincial governments, it had also contributed to fragmentation and unrest. In 1841, the government passed the interpretative law of the Additional Act, which clarified and limited the powers of provincial assemblies. This law returned significant authority over policing, judiciary appointments, and administration to the central government. To enforce these reforms, the imperial government relied heavily on the expanding national police force and military. A key institution in this period was the creation of the Guarda Nacional, or National Guard, a paramilitary force composed of local elites tasked with maintaining order. Though sometimes criticized for reinforcing elite control, the Guard helped suppress lingering unrest and extend imperial authority into more remote provinces. At the same time, Dom Pedro II's court began to promote a national identity that transcended provincial loyalties. Through public ceremonies, the expansion of education, and support for scientific and cultural institutions, the emperor and his ministers encouraged a shared sense of Brazilianness. The monarchy positioned itself as a guardian of both order and progress, preserving imperial unity while embracing modernization. These efforts bore fruit in the realm of political stability. By the mid-1840s, the worst of the regional revolts had been quelled. In the south, negotiations with rebel leaders brought the Farroupilha War to an end in 1845. Rather than continuing a costly military campaign, the imperial government offered generous terms to the rebels, including amnesty, the integration of rebel officers into the national army, and limited autonomy. This conciliatory approach helped reintegrate the region without provoking further violence. Dom Pedro's personal style of rule also contributed to his growing popularity. Unlike his father, he was known for his calm temperament, lack of vanity, and dedication to public service. He held regular audiences with citizens, maintained a modest lifestyle, and frequently toured different parts of the country. These gestures, while symbolic, helped humanize the monarchy and strengthen its bond with the Brazilian population. In terms of political practice, the early years of Dom Pedro II's reign were marked by the alternating dominance of the conservative and liberal parties. The emperor acted as a stabilizing force, using the moderating power to shift between parties as needed to preserve balance. This system, known as rotativism, became a hallmark of the Brazilian Empire's parliamentary politics. It allowed for controlled political competition and regular turnover in government, reducing the risk of polarization or authoritarianism. Though political life remained restricted to a small elite, voting was limited by property and literacy requirements. This system provided a degree of predictability and institutional continuity that was rare in Latin America at the time. While neighboring republics often suffered from coups, dictatorships, and civil wars, Brazil under Dom Pedro II enjoyed relative peace and constitutional order. Economic recovery was another key aspect of this consolidation period. The end of major internal conflicts allowed agriculture and trade to expand once again. Coffee, in particular, became the cornerstone of Brazil's export economy. While sugar and cotton remained important, it was coffee that drove new investment, immigration, and infrastructure projects. The coffee boom was centered in the southeastern provinces of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. Large plantations, often worked by enslaved labor, produced increasing quantities for export to European and North American markets. The wealth generated by coffee enabled the growth of new cities, the construction of roads and ports, and the rise of a powerful landowning class, often referred to as the coffee barons. This economic shift also had political consequences. The southeastern elites who controlled the coffee trade became key players in imperial politics. Their influence within the conservative and liberal parties helped shape national policy, particularly in matters related to trade, taxation, and labor. At the same time, growing economic ties with Britain deepened Brazil's integration into global markets. British merchants, investors, and diplomats were deeply involved in Brazilian finance, infrastructure, and diplomacy. While this brought benefits, such as loans, technology, and naval protection, it also exposed Brazil to external pressures, especially on issues like the slave trade. By the end of the 1840s, the Empire of Brazil had largely regained its footing. The rebellions of the Regency were over. The provinces, though diverse and sometimes restive, were once again under central control. The economy was expanding, the political system had stabilized, and the emperor had won widespread respect as a symbol of unity and moderation. But beneath this surface of stability, deeper questions remained unresolved. Slavery, which still underpinned much of the economy, was becoming a growing source of international criticism and domestic debate. Social inequalities persisted, and the limited nature of political participation left many Brazilians excluded from power. As the Brazilian Empire entered the second half of the 19th century, its economic engine was running at full speed. The country had found its principal source of export wealth in coffee, and the global appetite for the crop seemed insatiable. From the port of Rio de Janeiro to the expanding interior of São Paulo, coffee plantations reshaped the geography, labor structure, and political influence of the empire. But this prosperity was built on a foundation that was increasingly difficult to defend: slavery. Brazil, by the mid-1800s, had become the largest coffee producer in the world, supplying markets in Europe and North America. The southeastern provinces, particularly São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais, were the epicenters of this transformation. Vast plantations, known as fazendas, lined the countryside, growing millions of pounds of coffee each year. These estates were owned by a rising elite of landowners, often referred to as barões do café, or coffee barons. These planters were not merely agricultural entrepreneurs. They were also key political actors. Their wealth allowed them to dominate provincial governments, influence imperial policy, and fund infrastructure projects like railroads and ports. Many were elected to the General Assembly or held local offices, and they became a critical power block within the empire's ruling structure. As their economic importance grew, so did their expectations of political protection and continuity, especially regarding the labor force that sustained their wealth. At the center of that labor system was slavery. Even as other nations across the Atlantic world were abolishing slavery or phasing out the trade in enslaved Africans, Brazil remained deeply committed to the institution. By the 1840s, Brazil held the largest enslaved population in the Western Hemisphere. Estimates suggest that roughly 1/3 of the entire population was enslaved during this period, though proportions varied by region. The persistence of slavery in Brazil was not simply due to tradition. It was deeply tied to the empire's economic model. Coffee cultivation was labor-intensive, requiring a large, disciplined workforce to plant, harvest, and process beans. For plantation owners, enslaved labor provided a reliable and, once acquired, low-cost source of labor. The profitability of the coffee economy reinforced their resistance to any changes that might threaten the system. Yet the contradictions of this system became increasingly difficult to ignore. On the international stage, Brazil faced mounting pressure from Britain to end the transatlantic slave trade. Although Brazil had signed treaties promising to suppress the trade, most notably in the early 1800s, enforcement remained lax. Slave ships continued to arrive clandestinely on the Brazilian coast, especially in the southeast and northeast, well into the 1840s. The turning point came in 1845, when the British Parliament passed the Aberdeen Act. This law authorized the British Navy to seize and condemn Brazilian slave ships operating in the Atlantic. The British justified their actions as part of a global anti-slavery campaign, but Brazilian officials viewed it as a violation of national sovereignty. The resulting diplomatic tensions nearly led to conflict. Facing British naval enforcement and international embarrassment, the Brazilian government was forced to act. In 1850, under pressure from both internal and external actors, Brazil passed the Eusébio de Queiroz law, which formally outlawed the transatlantic slave trade. The law was named after the then Minister of Justice, who had committed to ending illegal trafficking and enforcing the law on Brazilian soil. The Eusébio de Queiroz law marked a turning point in Brazil's labor and economic history. Though it did not end slavery itself, it made the importation of new enslaved Africans illegal. This had several immediate consequences. First, it led to the rise of internal slave markets, as planters in expanding regions like São Paulo purchased enslaved workers from older areas where agriculture was declining. Second, it sparked new discussions among elites about labor alternatives, including immigration. In the years following the ban, Brazilian planters, especially in São Paulo, began experimenting with free labor. European immigrants, particularly Italians and Germans, were encouraged to settle and work on coffee plantations. The government and private landowners offered travel subsidies and land incentives. While the results were mixed, these efforts marked the beginning of a slow shift away from enslaved labor, driven as much by economic pragmatism as by moral reform. Still, slavery remained firmly in place, and abolition was not yet on the political horizon. The empire's ruling class, including many within the Senate and Chamber of Deputies, were themselves slave owners or deeply connected to the plantation economy. The political system, though formally constitutional, was designed to limit radical change. Voting rights were restricted to a small literate and propertied elite, and press freedoms, though expanding, were not universal. Even so, opposition to slavery began to grow. In major cities, a small but vocal abolitionist movement emerged. Writers, journalists, lawyers, and religious figures began to question the morality and sustainability of slavery. Abolitionist newspapers appeared in Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and São Paulo. Public lectures and pamphlets circulated arguments against the institution. Some drew from Enlightenment ideals, others from Christian ethics, and still others from economic analysis. Notably, enslaved people themselves continued to resist. Resistance took many forms: running away, forming quilombos, runaway slave communities, organizing revolts, or using legal channels to demand freedom. Brazilian law allowed for alforria, or manumission, through purchase or grant. Some enslaved people managed to accumulate funds and buy their freedom. Others were freed by sympathetic owners or through religious institutions. Throughout the 1850s and early 1860s, the debate over slavery grew louder. While the empire tried to maintain a balance between economic growth and political stability, the contradictions became more visible. Foreign observers, particularly from Britain and the United States, criticized Brazil's continued reliance on slave labor. International conferences and diplomatic correspondence often included pointed questions about the status of abolition. Despite this growing tension, the government remained cautious. Dom Pedro the Second, though personally opposed to slavery, was reluctant to force the issue without broad elite support. His approach was one of gradualism, believing that over time, slavery would become obsolete through social and economic transformation. This caution allowed the system to persist longer in Brazil than in any other country in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of the 1850s, Brazil was a paradox. It was a constitutional monarchy with growing cities, a literate middle class, and a vibrant intellectual scene. It was also a slave-holding society, deeply dependent on coerced labor. These contradictions would define the next phase of imperial history, as calls for abolition grew louder and reformers began pushing the monarchy to act. While internal debates over slavery and economic development shaped much of Brazil's 19th century trajectory, the empire also faced challenges and opportunities beyond its borders. Throughout the imperial era, Brazil was not merely a passive observer of South American affairs. It was an active regional power, projecting influence through diplomacy, military interventions, and war. This outward-facing role helped define Brazil's national identity and its imperial ambitions. Brazil's first significant military engagement as an independent empire occurred almost immediately after its declaration of sovereignty. The Cisplatin War, beginning in 1825, pitted Brazil against the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, an early forerunner of modern Argentina. At the heart of the conflict was control over the Cisplatin province, a region roughly corresponding to present-day Uruguay. The territory had been annexed by Portuguese forces in the early 19th century and later absorbed by Brazil. However, its population was ethnically and culturally closer to the Spanish-speaking world. In 1825, local rebels, supported by Buenos Aires, declared independence from Brazil. Dom Pedro the First responded by mobilizing imperial forces to maintain Brazilian control. The war lasted 3 years and proved inconclusive. Though Brazil maintained naval superiority, it struggled to gain ground on land. The conflict drained financial resources and revealed the limits of Brazilian military capability. By 1828, Britain brokered the Treaty of Montevideo, which granted Uruguay independence as a buffer state between Brazil and Argentina. Though the treaty preserved peace, it marked a strategic setback for Brazil and showed the challenges of asserting imperial claims in a volatile region. In the decades that followed, Brazil remained vigilant along its southern border, but direct conflict was largely avoided. Instead, Brazil increasingly positioned itself as a stabilizing force in South America, often intervening in neighboring countries under the pretext of preserving order or supporting constitutional governments. These actions were driven by a mix of strategic interest and ideological alignment with moderate liberal regimes. In the 1840s and 50s, Brazil became entangled in the internal politics of Uruguay, where rival factions, the Colorados and the Blancos, competed for control. The Colorados were generally more liberal and aligned with Brazilian and Argentine liberal interests, while the Blancos leaned more conservative and often aligned with regional caudillos. Brazil's military support for the Colorados, including naval interventions and troop deployments, reflected its broader aim to maintain influence in the Platin region and counterbalance Argentine ambitions. Brazil's willingness to intervene militarily in Uruguay, sometimes without formal declarations of war, sparked tension with Argentina and Paraguay. Yet it also demonstrated the empire's growing confidence in its regional role. These actions laid the groundwork for Brazil's involvement in its most significant foreign conflict, the Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance. Fought between 1864 and 1870, the Paraguayan War was the largest and deadliest conflict in South American history. It began as a dispute over regional navigation rights and internal Uruguayan politics, but it quickly escalated when Paraguay, led by President Francisco Solano Lopez, invaded Brazilian territory in Mato Grosso and then attacked Argentine provinces. Paraguay's leadership believed it could establish regional dominance by striking first, anticipating that Brazil and Argentina were too divided to respond effectively. Instead, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay formed a formal alliance, the Triple Alliance, and launched a massive joint military campaign against Paraguay. The war quickly expanded into a total war, drawing in tens of thousands of soldiers, massive logistical operations, and prolonged campaigns over challenging terrain. Brazil contributed the largest military force to the alliance, eventually mobilizing over 100,000 troops. This required substantial financial and organizational effort. The imperial government raised taxes, took foreign loans, and reorganized the army. It also enlisted enslaved people with promises of freedom in exchange for military service, a decision that would have lasting social implications. Dom Pedro the Second took a personal interest in the war effort. Though he never fought on the battlefield, he visited troops, approved strategies, and supported logistics. His daughter, Princess Isabel, acted as regent during his absences, demonstrating the monarchy's commitment to the national cause. The war became a test of national unity and imperial legitimacy. Despite their numerical superiority, the Triple Alliance faced stiff resistance. Paraguayan forces were well prepared and motivated. The war dragged on for 6 brutal years, resulting in widespread destruction, especially within Paraguay. Disease, famine, and battle claimed a devastating toll on both military personnel and civilians. By the war's end in 1870, Paraguay had been utterly devastated. Its population was decimated. Some estimates suggest that up to half of its people perished, and its economy lay in ruins. Francisco Solano Lopez was killed in battle, and Brazilian troops occupied much of the country for years after. For Brazil, the war was a mixed outcome. On one hand, it had proven its military capability and affirmed its status as the dominant power in the Southern Cone. The victory enhanced national pride and the prestige of the monarchy. On the other hand, the war placed immense strain on the economy and exposed limitations in infrastructure and administration. The post-war years also left lingering questions. Brazil had expended vast resources to defeat a neighbor that posed no direct threat to its sovereignty. The occupation of Paraguay was costly and unpopular, and the war's brutality led to criticism at home and abroad. Moreover, the mobilization of enslaved soldiers, many of whom were freed during or after the war, contributed to growing calls for the abolition of slavery. One of the enduring consequences of the Paraguayan War was the elevation of the Brazilian military as a national institution. The army, once a relatively minor force, emerged from the war with greater political influence and organizational coherence. Officers returning from the front began to demand more say in governance, and some would become leading figures in later political movements, including the eventual fall of the monarchy. The war also led to a broader sense of national integration. Soldiers from different provinces, classes, and backgrounds had fought side by side. This shared experience, though traumatic, helped foster a sense of common Brazilian identity that transcended regional divisions. It also shifted public expectations about the role of government and the rights of citizens, particularly veterans. In short, Brazil's regional interventions between the 1820s and the 1870s reflected both imperial ambition and strategic pragmatism. From the Cisplatin War to the occupation of Paraguay, Brazil acted to shape its geopolitical environment, defend its borders, and project its influence. These actions solidified its position as the dominant force in South America, but they also deepened internal tensions and accelerated changes that would eventually challenge the very foundations of the empire. By the middle of the 19th century, Emperor Dom Pedro the Second had firmly established his authority, and the Brazilian Empire had become a relatively stable and expansive constitutional monarchy. Yet, for all its imperial traditions, Brazil was not content to remain static. Under Dom Pedro II's leadership, the empire entered a phase of cultural, scientific, and infrastructural transformation. The monarch, more scholar than soldier, ushered in an era of modernization rooted in reason, education, and gradual reform. Dom Pedro II's personal philosophy played a significant role in shaping this era. Unlike many of his contemporaries among global monarchs, he was an intellectual at heart. Fluent in several languages, including French, English, German, and Latin, he corresponded with renowned scientists and thinkers such as Charles Darwin, Louis Pasteur, and Victor Hugo. He read widely, traveled extensively, and cultivated a deep appreciation for history, astronomy, and the natural sciences. His belief in progress, when guided by rational thought and public service, became the guiding principle of his reign. One of his earliest and most consistent priorities was education. Though Brazil still had low literacy rates by global standards, the emperor saw knowledge as the foundation for national development. During the 1850s and 1860s, schools were expanded in urban areas. Teacher training institutes were created, and scholarships were offered for Brazilian students to study abroad. Though education remained largely inaccessible to the rural poor and enslaved populations, these reforms laid the groundwork for an emerging middle class of literate professionals, bureaucrats, and urban merchants. To support the spread of knowledge and culture, Dom Pedro II also sponsored scientific institutions and cultural academies. The Imperial Academy of Medicine, the Brazilian Historic and Geographic Institute, and the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro all flourished during his reign. These institutions fostered research in natural history, anthropology, and cartography, helping to catalog the vastness and diversity of Brazil's territory and peoples. In addition to promoting science, the emperor took a personal interest in technological innovation. He was among the first leaders in the Americas to embrace photography, telegraphy, and rail transport. In public appearances, he often demonstrated new inventions and expressed keen interest in their practical applications. His enthusiasm for modernization was not just symbolic. It was tied to a vision of Brazil as a forward-looking nation that could stand alongside the great powers of the world. The effects of this vision became visible in Brazil's infrastructure. Beginning in the 1850s, the empire invested heavily in transportation. Roads were expanded, river routes were surveyed, and, most notably, railways began to crisscross key economic regions. The first Brazilian railway, inaugurated in 1854, connected the port of Mauá to the coffee-growing interior of Rio de Janeiro province. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of kilometers of track were laid, linking agricultural zones to ports and boosting internal trade. The spread of railways also contributed to urban growth. Cities like São Paulo, Campinas, and Juiz de Fora experienced population increases and economic expansion driven by coffee exports and improved mobility. These urban centers became hubs of commerce, immigration, and social change, attracting not only Brazilians from the countryside, but also newcomers from Europe. European immigration was another hallmark of the period. In an effort to supplement the labor force, especially following the decline of the transatlantic slave trade, the empire encouraged settlers from Italy, Germany, and Portugal to move to Brazil. Many of these immigrants settled in the southern provinces, where they established agricultural colonies and contributed to the diversification of local economies. While some immigrants found opportunities, others struggled with poor conditions and labor exploitation, highlighting the complexities of the migration process. Brazil's economy during this period was still dominated by coffee, but new sectors began to emerge. Textiles, sugar refining, and food processing developed in cities with access to both labor and transportation. Banks and credit institutions expanded, facilitating investment in land, infrastructure, and trade. The state began experimenting with tariff policies, customs regulation, and public finance, often borrowing models from European nations while adapting them to Brazilian realities. Despite the expansion of wealth and modernization in many sectors, structural inequality remained profound. The vast majority of Brazilians, particularly in rural areas, lived in poverty. Slavery still persisted as a central institution, especially on the coffee plantations of São Paulo and the sugar estates of the Northeast. Though many elites spoke of progress and civilization, the continued existence of slavery underscored a deep contradiction at the heart of the empire. Culturally, the period saw the flourishing of a distinct Brazilian intellectual and artistic identity. Romanticism became the dominant literary and artistic style of the mid-century, blending European influences with Brazilian themes. Writers such as José de Alencar and Gonçalves Dias explored the country's indigenous heritage, landscapes, and national myths. Their works helped construct a narrative of Brazilian uniqueness, one rooted in cultural mixture, natural beauty, and historical endurance. The theater, press, and visual arts also expanded. Newspapers circulated in major cities, offering commentary on politics, science, and daily life. The growth of the press contributed to a more informed urban public and introduced new spaces for debate. Though censorship laws remained, the overall environment was increasingly conducive to the exchange of ideas. Dom Pedro the Second himself became a patron of the arts. He supported painters, sculptors, and composers, many of whom looked to blend European techniques with Brazilian themes. Music in particular began to reflect both classical forms and Afro-Brazilian rhythms, foreshadowing the rich musical traditions that would later define Brazil. Perhaps the most notable aspect of this modernizing phase was the emperor's ability to project stability. While other Latin American nations experienced frequent coups, civil wars, and authoritarian regimes, Brazil maintained constitutional government under a symbolic but active monarch. The regular alternation of power between conservative and liberal parties, managed through the emperor's moderating influence, created a sense of political normalcy. Though the system remained elitist and excluded the vast majority of citizens from formal participation, it provided continuity in an often volatile region. Dom Pedro II's image as a wise and just monarch gained international recognition. He was welcomed in European courts, awarded honorary memberships in scientific academies, and praised by foreign observers for his intellect and moderation. In Brazil, he was both admired and idealized, a father figure who embodied the virtues of enlightened monarchy. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict were quietly growing. The educated classes were beginning to question the limitations of political participation. The military, emboldened by its role in the Paraguayan War, sought greater autonomy and respect. Abolitionist sentiment, though still a minority view, was spreading through the press, religious circles, and parts of the imperial court. For the moment, however, the empire enjoyed a period of prosperity and intellectual ferment. Dom Pedro II's vision of a modern, educated, and unified Brazil seemed within reach. But modernization brought with it new demands for inclusion, for justice, and for deeper change. While the Brazilian Empire continued to expand its infrastructure, cultural institutions, and economic output during the mid-19th century, one institution cast a long and growing shadow over its progress: slavery. The contradiction between Brazil's modernization efforts and its continued dependence on enslaved labor became harder to ignore as international condemnation, domestic activism, and shifting economic dynamics converged to push the country, gradually and often reluctantly, toward abolition. Slavery had been a cornerstone of Brazil's economy and social structure for more than 3 centuries. Even as the transatlantic slave trade was banned in the early 1850s, the internal slave economy remained robust. Plantations in southeastern Brazil, especially those producing coffee, relied heavily on enslaved Africans and Afro-Brazilians to sustain their profits. These workers endured long hours, harsh treatment, and systemic violence with few legal protections. Yet from the middle of the century onward, the ground beneath slavery began to shift. The first major factor driving this change was international pressure. Britain, which had abolished slavery throughout its empire earlier in the century, continued to pressure Brazil diplomatically and economically. British warships had already been deployed in previous decades to stop slave ships, and abolitionist politicians in London frequently denounced Brazil's human bondage in parliamentary debates. While Brazil remained firm in protecting its sovereignty, these pressures chipped away at the legitimacy of the slave system in the eyes of the global community. Within Brazil itself, the abolitionist cause began to find its voice. Though still limited in scope and reach, a growing number of intellectuals, politicians, and members of the clergy began to speak out against slavery. Newspapers carried opinion pieces and poetry condemning the practice. Lawyers defended enslaved people seeking manumission. Catholic leaders, especially Jesuits and progressive priests, used sermons and pamphlets to argue that slavery was incompatible with Christian values. One of the key figures to emerge in this period was Joaquim Nabuco, a lawyer, writer, and politician from Pernambuco. Deeply influenced by Enlightenment principles and by his own encounters with slavery's cruelty, Nabuco became one of the leading abolitionist voices in the empire. His writings, including the seminal O Abolicionismo, argued not only for the moral urgency of emancipation, but also for its political and economic necessity. He believed that Brazil could not claim to be a civilized nation while continuing to hold people in bondage. But the push for abolition did not rest solely with elites. Enslaved people themselves were central to the process. They resisted slavery in countless ways, by escaping to quilombos or maroon communities, by slowing down work, by resisting orders, or by forging documents that allowed them to move or claim freedom. As manumission laws allowed enslaved people to purchase their own freedom in some cases, many found ways to negotiate or save toward liberation, often with the help of religious brotherhoods or mutual aid societies. Urban centers became important sites of resistance and activism. In cities like Rio de Janeiro and Salvador, free and freed black communities established schools, associations, and newspapers that advocated for abolition and equal rights. These communities challenged the prevailing notion that slavery was a natural and unchangeable institution. The imperial government, however, moved cautiously. It feared alienating the powerful landowning class, particularly in the southeastern provinces where coffee exports dominated the economy. Many of these elites viewed slavery as essential and warned that its abolition would lead to labor shortages, economic collapse, or even rebellion. Nevertheless, incremental reforms began to emerge, often shaped by political compromise. The first of these was the Law of the Free Womb, passed in 1871. Officially known as the Rio Branco Law, named after the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, it declared that all children born to enslaved mothers after the law's enactment would be free. However, the law also allowed enslavers to keep these children in their care until they reached adulthood, typically defined as 21 years of age. While the law marked a symbolic shift, it offered limited immediate change in practice. The Law of the Free Womb was followed by the Sexagenarian Law in 1885. This legislation granted freedom to all enslaved persons over the age of 65. Yet even this reform was laced with limitations. Many enslaved people did not live to such an age due to the brutality of their conditions, and those who did were often too old to work, making the law more palatable to slaveholders than it might have seemed. Despite their limited practical impact, these laws contributed to a broader transformation in Brazilian society. The legal trend toward abolition gave momentum to grassroots movements, sharpened the divisions within elite circles, and emboldened both reformers and the enslaved. By the mid-1880s, abolitionism had become a national issue. The final push toward emancipation gained strength in urban and provincial centers alike. Abolitionist societies were established throughout the empire. Fundraising events, theatrical performances, and public lectures raised money to purchase enslaved individuals' freedom. These efforts, while symbolic, created a new kind of political activism that drew in students, professionals, and women, many of whom had been excluded from traditional political life. In São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, organized mass campaigns were launched to free entire groups of enslaved people. In the province of Ceará, the abolitionist movement achieved a major victory when, in 1884, local leaders declared the province free of slavery ahead of national legislation. Other provinces followed suit in the years that followed, creating a patchwork of emancipation across the empire. Faced with mounting social pressure, economic transformation, and growing political isolation, the imperial court moved toward a final act. In May of 1888, the Brazilian parliament debated and passed the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law. This short but powerful decree consisted of just 2 articles, one abolishing slavery throughout the empire, and the other declaring the law to take immediate effect. It made no provision for compensation to slaveholders and no formal support for freed individuals. On May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel, acting as regent while Dom Pedro the Second was abroad, signed the law into effect. As the emperor's daughter and heir presumptive, her role in the abolition process gained both political and symbolic weight. Celebrations erupted in cities and towns across Brazil, particularly among freed communities. Churches rang their bells, newspapers published special editions, and people filled the streets in spontaneous demonstrations of joy. Yet behind the jubilation lay deeper tensions. The Golden Law did not offer land, work, or citizenship to the newly freed population. Millions of Afro-Brazilians found themselves without resources or protection in a society still deeply shaped by racial prejudice and economic inequality. While slavery had been formally abolished, the legacies of exclusion and exploitation remained deeply entrenched. Among the former slave-holding elite, resentment was widespread. Many blamed the monarchy for the loss of their labor force and felt betrayed by a government they had long supported. This discontent would soon become politically consequential. On May 13, 1888, Brazil entered a new era. With the stroke of a pen, Princess Isabel, acting as regent, signed into law the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law, which abolished slavery throughout the Empire of Brazil. This moment marked the formal end of one of the most enduring and brutal systems in the Americas. Brazil had been the last independent nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, and the moment was both triumphant and deeply consequential. The Golden Law was deceptively brief. Its 2 articles stated, simply and unequivocally, that slavery was abolished in Brazil and that the law would take immediate effect. There were no clauses for gradual implementation, no financial compensation for slave owners, and no detailed provisions for the support or integration of the newly freed population. The simplicity of the law reflected its moral clarity, but also its political delicacy. The signing of the law was greeted with widespread celebrations across many cities, especially among the free black population and abolitionist circles. Churches rang their bells, newspapers published glowing headlines, and public squares filled with spontaneous demonstrations of joy. In Rio de Janeiro, processions of formerly enslaved people marched through the streets alongside students, artists, and intellectuals. The empire had finally answered a demand that had been echoing for decades. For Princess Isabel, the act was the defining moment of her public life. As regent during her father's absence, she had taken on the responsibility of resolving one of Brazil's most contentious and morally charged issues. Deeply religious and influenced by her Catholic upbringing, Isabel believed that abolition was both a political necessity and a Christian duty. Her decision, though supported by many in the capital and the abolitionist movement, came with heavy political costs. Among Brazil's landed elite, the powerful plantation owners of the southeast and northeast, the Golden Law was seen as a betrayal. These were the same families that had long supported the monarchy, held seats in parliament, and financed the empire's infrastructure. They had lobbied against abolition or, at the very least, expected compensation for the loss of what they regarded as their property. When no such provisions were included in the Golden Law, their support for the monarchy rapidly eroded. This sense of betrayal was compounded by the perception that the monarchy had aligned itself with urban intellectuals, abolitionist clergy, and an increasingly assertive press, groups that many in the rural elite viewed with suspicion. For the first time, the empire was seen by its traditional base not as a protector of order and property, but as an agent of disruptive social change. While elite dissatisfaction brewed, the freed population faced an entirely different reality. For the nearly 1 million Brazilians who had been enslaved at the time of abolition, freedom came without land, housing, employment guarantees, or legal protections. There was no national plan to integrate former slaves into the labor market or society at large. The empire's political class, in its haste to end slavery, had done little to prepare for the day after. Many newly freed individuals remained in the rural areas where they had been enslaved, often continuing to work on the same plantations under exploitative conditions. Others migrated to urban centers, hoping for better opportunities. In cities like Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and Recife, black communities formed neighborhoods, mutual aid societies, and cultural associations that would later become key to Brazil's Afro-descendant identity. Still, racism and structural inequality remained pervasive, and economic mobility was limited. Meanwhile, the abolition of slavery had shifted the political balance within the empire. One of the monarchy's long-standing sources of support, the landowning elite, was now alienated. The emperor, Dom Pedro the Second, had hoped that abolition would strengthen Brazil's moral standing in the world and bring long-term peace at home. But instead, the monarchy found itself isolated, increasingly reliant on a shrinking base of loyalists. The political system itself was showing signs of strain. Although Brazil had enjoyed decades of relative stability under the alternating leadership of the conservative and liberal parties, these parties had become ossified and unresponsive to new social demands. The electorate remained small, limited to literate men of property, and many Brazilians felt excluded from the political process. Adding to this tension was the growing assertiveness of the military. Having played a significant role in the Paraguayan War, the officer corps had developed a sense of professional identity and political awareness. Many young officers had embraced positivist philosophy, particularly the ideas of Auguste Comte, which emphasized order, progress, and scientific rationalism over hereditary monarchy. These officers, often better educated than the civilian political elite, began to question the legitimacy of the monarchy. They saw the emperor's cautious style of governance as outdated and unresponsive to the needs of a modernizing society. Some resented the monarchy's refusal to allow military officers greater participation in government, while others were frustrated by the continued domination of politics by coffee barons and aristocratic families. The abolition of slavery also influenced the military's political orientation. Many officers viewed the lack of a structured transition as evidence of imperial weakness. They saw the monarchy's inability to manage the post-abolition labor crisis as a failure of leadership and a threat to national stability. As economic anxieties mounted and Republican ideas gained traction in the military press, a new sense of purpose began to take root among Brazil's officer corps. Meanwhile, Republican sentiment was no longer confined to fringe intellectual circles. It had grown steadily through the 1880s, fueled by dissatisfaction with the monarchy's political rigidity, its perceived favoritism, and its failure to modernize institutions. Republican clubs and newspapers proliferated, especially in urban centers and in the southern provinces. Influential voices like Benjamin Constant and Quintino Bocaiúva began articulating a vision for a Brazilian republic, secular, centralized, and governed by merit rather than inheritance. Dom Pedro the Second, by this point in his 70s, appeared increasingly detached. Though respected for his intellect and personal modesty, he had lost much of his political vigor. His long absences from court, declining health, and reluctance to confront the growing Republican and military unrest left the monarchy vulnerable. His heir, Princess Isabel, had admirers but also detractors. Many elites, already disillusioned by abolition, viewed the prospect of a female monarch with skepticism, if not outright hostility. The monarchy, which had once served as a symbol of unity and progress, now stood exposed. The Golden Law, though a moral and historical triumph, had catalyzed a series of political realignments that the imperial system was ill-prepared to manage. Freed people were left to navigate an unequal society, the aristocracy turned away from the crown, and the military began to look elsewhere for leadership. By the end of the 1880s, the Brazilian Empire stood on increasingly shaky ground. The once stable monarchy, which had weathered wars, regional revolts, and political reforms, now faced a new and more existential threat, not from rebellion or foreign invasion, but from within its own institutions. A growing Republican movement, discontent within the military, and alienation of traditional elites converged into a national crisis that the aging Dom Pedro II could not contain. The ideological seeds of republicanism had been planted decades earlier, but in the final years of the empire, they blossomed into a fully organized movement. Republican ideas had long circulated in intellectual and academic circles, especially among students, journalists, and professionals in cities like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Porto Alegre. Influenced by the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, and positivist philosophy, many began to see the monarchy not as a symbol of unity and progress, but as an outdated institution blocking democratic development. The Manifesto Republicano, issued in the late 1870s by a group of intellectuals and politicians in São Paulo, had called for the establishment of a federal republic. Though initially dismissed by imperial authorities, the manifesto gained credibility as public dissatisfaction with the monarchy increased. By the 1880s, Republican clubs had been established across the country. Newspapers championed the Republican cause, and public figures openly questioned the legitimacy of imperial rule. At the heart of this movement was a growing frustration with political stagnation. Brazil's parliamentary system had become increasingly unresponsive to societal demands. The two dominant parties, the liberals and conservatives, rotated power in a controlled system that excluded large swaths of the population. Elections were often manipulated, and real policy debate was limited. Many Brazilians, especially in the rising urban middle classes, felt locked out of political life. This exclusion was compounded by economic frustration. Though the coffee economy continued to grow, wealth remained highly concentrated, and much of the country's labor force remained underpaid, landless, and marginalized. The empire had abolished slavery, but it had done little to redistribute land or provide opportunity to the formerly enslaved. Immigration was expanding, but many immigrants faced exploitation and lacked legal protections. Meanwhile, the military had become an increasingly politicized institution. The officer corps, particularly younger officers trained in military academies influenced by positivist philosophy, began to view the empire as inefficient, corrupt, and aristocratic. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a modern Brazil, disciplined, scientific, and merit-based. Many were frustrated by the lack of advancement opportunities and the civilian government's tight control over promotions and military budgets. Key figures emerged from within the military who would later play central roles in the empire's demise. Among them was Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, a respected veteran of the Paraguayan War. Though initially a monarchist and loyal to Dom Pedro the Second, Deodoro found himself caught between personal loyalty and growing pressure from Republican colleagues and military officers who were convinced that the empire was no longer viable. The abolition of slavery in 1888, while celebrated by many, further destabilized imperial alliances. As discussed in the previous section, the monarchy lost the support of powerful landowners who had once formed its political backbone. These elites, particularly in the coffee-growing provinces, were outraged by the lack of compensation and deeply resentful of Princess Isabel's role in pushing the measure through Parliament. Their discontent, combined with the rise of Republican rhetoric and military restlessness, created a political vacuum. The monarchy found itself increasingly isolated. Dom Pedro the Second, though still respected for his intellect and moral character, had withdrawn from public life. His health was in decline, and he spent much of his time abroad or in retreat at his residence in Petropolis. Many Brazilians admired him personally, but fewer saw the imperial system he represented as a solution to the country's problems. Princess Isabel, who had acted as regent on multiple occasions and was legally the heir to the throne, was a figure of controversy. While abolitionists and segments of the clergy admired her compassion and moral resolve, many elites viewed her as unsuited for leadership. Her association with religious conservatism and her foreign-born husband, the Count of Eu, made her a target of criticism from both Republicans and secular nationalists. The idea of a female sovereign ascending to the throne at a time of political instability was unacceptable to much of the political class. As Republican sentiment gained momentum, the monarchy made few efforts to counter it. Dom Pedro II's reluctance to engage in political self-preservation stemmed from his belief that Brazil's future should be determined by its people, not by the crown's desire to cling to power. In private correspondence, he expressed his indifference toward the fate of the throne and a desire for personal retirement rather than political confrontation. This passivity would prove fatal. By 1889, the situation had reached a boiling point. Rumors of a planned coup circulated in political and military circles, and the imperial government, perhaps underestimating the seriousness of the threat, took no decisive action. Civilian ministers remained divided, with some urging reforms and others calling for crackdowns on Republican activism. At the same time, President of the Council of Ministers Viscount of Ouro Preto attempted to implement a series of modest reforms aimed at appeasing various factions, including electoral reform and decentralization. However, these proposals satisfied neither Republicans nor monarchists and came too late to restore confidence in the imperial regime. In November of that year, tensions reached a breaking point. A group of military officers, including key members of the army's top command, began planning an overt move against the monarchy. Their decision was not driven by public uprising or mass demonstrations, but by a calculation that the emperor had lost the ability to govern and that a republic could better serve national interests. The person chosen to lead the coup was Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca. Though initially hesitant and personally loyal to Dom Pedro II, Deodoro was ultimately persuaded by the argument that the empire was in decline and that Republican leadership was inevitable. On November 15, 1889, Deodoro led a peaceful military movement that deposed the emperor and proclaimed the Republic of Brazil. The coup was swift and bloodless. Troops occupied key government buildings in Rio de Janeiro. The imperial family was placed under house arrest and then escorted to a ship bound for exile in Europe. No shots were fired, no lives were lost. The fall of the Brazilian Empire, one of the most enduring monarchies in the Americas, came not with civil war, but with resignation and quiet transition. The Brazilian monarchy came to an abrupt and peaceful end on November 15, 1889. After nearly 7 decades of imperial rule, the nation transitioned to a republic not through revolution or widespread civil unrest, but through a calculated, bloodless military coup carried out by a small circle of officers and politicians. The fall of the empire was not marked by chaos in the streets, but by quiet resignation in the palace, and by an emperor who refused to cling to power with violence. The final days of the Brazilian Empire were shaped by a rapid chain of events that unfolded in the capital, Rio de Janeiro. Growing dissatisfaction within the military had come to a head, particularly among younger officers inspired by positivist philosophy and resentful of their lack of political influence. These officers had long viewed the monarchy as stagnant and outdated, a relic in an age increasingly shaped by scientific progress, nationalism, and republican ideals. Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, a decorated veteran and a respected figure among both monarchists and republicans, became the focal point of the coup. Deodoro had been reluctant to lead an uprising against the emperor, for whom he maintained personal respect. However, his loyalty to the crown had been worn down by political maneuvering, perceived slights from the imperial cabinet, and growing pressure from his fellow officers. The immediate trigger for the coup was the decision by the Viscount of Ouro Preto, head of the imperial cabinet, to propose reforms that included the reorganization of the military command structure. These proposed changes threatened the autonomy and status of several key officers, especially those aligned with the Republican cause. The fear that the imperial government would clamp down on dissent prompted the conspirators to act swiftly. On the morning of November 15th, troops under the command of Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca gathered in the heart of Rio de Janeiro. Without firing a shot, they surrounded government buildings, declared the imperial cabinet dismissed, and proclaimed the end of the monarchy. The government offered no resistance. The emperor, who had returned to Rio only days earlier from his country residence in Petropolis, was informed of the coup later that afternoon. Dom Pedro the Second's response was characteristically calm. He asked only whether there had been violence. When assured that the transition had been peaceful, he expressed relief. In his final audience as emperor, he told his ministers and close advisors that he harbored no bitterness and that if Brazil no longer desired a monarchy, he would not stand in the way. That evening, he returned to his residence and began preparing to leave the country. Within 48 hours, the imperial family was placed on board the cruiser Alagoas, bound for exile in Europe. The new Republican authorities issued a decree expelling the Braganza family from Brazilian territory, but permitted them to leave peacefully and with their personal belongings. No members of the family were imprisoned or harmed. There were no summary trials, no public executions, and no mass purges of imperial loyalists. Thus ended the Empire of Brazil, not with revolution, but with a withdrawal. In the place of monarchy, the first Brazilian Republic was proclaimed. A provisional government, dominated by military officers and civilian republicans, took control. A new flag, modeled loosely on the United States flag and bearing the positivist motto, "Order and Progress," replaced the imperial green and gold banner emblazoned with the royal coat of arms. Though many symbols changed quickly, the new republic inherited most of the imperial state's institutions and structures. In the provinces, reactions to the coup varied. Many Brazilians, especially in rural areas, had little immediate understanding of what had occurred. The monarchy had been remote for many, and imperial politics were seen as distant affairs. In cities, Republican clubs and newspapers celebrated the birth of the republic. Some regions, particularly in the south and northeast, expressed concern about centralization and the growing power of the military, foreshadowing future unrest. The departure of the emperor marked not only the end of a political regime, but also the closing of an era. Dom Pedro the Second had been Brazil's ruler for over half a century. Under his reign, the country had maintained stability, while neighboring republics experienced frequent upheaval. Brazil had grown economically, expanded its infrastructure, and slowly moved toward a more modern political system. Yet, in the final years of his rule, the same forces of modernization and reform that he had helped foster ultimately overwhelmed the imperial structure. There were no serious efforts to restore the monarchy in the immediate aftermath. The imperial family, now living in modest exile in Europe, refrained from political agitation. Support for the monarchy persisted among certain segments of the population, particularly older elites and conservative clergy. But no organized restoration movement emerged during the early years of the Republic. The new Republican regime, while initially popular among urban intellectuals and sections of the military, soon encountered its own challenges. Internal divisions between positivist and liberal factions, questions over the role of the military in governance, and struggles to establish an effective constitution would plague the Republic's early years. But the monarchy was gone, and its return was no longer part of the national conversation. In the long view of history, the fall of the Brazilian Empire remains a unique event. Few monarchies in the Americas lasted as long or ended with such little bloodshed. It was a testament to the character of Dom Pedro II that he refused to use force to defend his crown, even when he retained the loyalty of many within the armed forces and civil service. He chose dignity over violence, retirement over resistance. As the cruiser Alagoas carried the Brazilian imperial family away from Rio de Janeiro in November of 1889, Dom Pedro II quietly watched the coastline of his homeland disappear into the horizon. He had ruled Brazil for nearly 6 decades, guiding it through war, reform, and modernization. Now, deposed and aging, he entered exile with characteristic restraint and a sense of resignation rather than bitterness. The fall of the empire, though sudden, had not come as a complete shock to the emperor. In the years leading up to the coup, he had become increasingly aware of the forces arrayed against the monarchy. He had witnessed the erosion of elite support, the rise of republicanism within the military, and the public debates that questioned the relevance of hereditary rule in a modernizing Brazil. Despite this, he had chosen not to resist. For Dom Pedro II, the crown was a responsibility, not a privilege to be defended at all costs. He had always believed that his authority derived from the will of the Brazilian people, and when that will changed, he stepped aside without protest. The imperial family disembarked in Lisbon, Portugal, a country that had once been the seat of their dynasty, but was now unfamiliar territory for the deposed monarch. From there, they traveled to France, eventually settling in Paris, where they lived in modest accommodations. Far from a royal palace, their new home was an ordinary hotel, the Hotel Bedford, located near the Champs-Élysées. The transition from imperial grandeur to quiet exile was stark, yet Dom Pedro adapted with the same stoicism that had marked his rule. During his time in France, Dom Pedro II kept a low profile. He refused to involve himself in Brazilian politics, declined interviews, and discouraged any movement aimed at restoring the monarchy. He viewed the Republic as Brazil's chosen path and wished to avoid any action that could lead to civil discord or bloodshed. To those who asked about his feelings, he would respond with calm dignity, once stating, "I have fulfilled my duty, and I am ready for rest." Although far from home, Dom Pedro remained intellectually active. He spent much of his time reading, writing in his journals, and corresponding with scholars and former political associates. He visited museums, attended lectures, and maintained friendships with European scientists and writers. His personal interests, especially in languages, history, and the sciences, continued to occupy his thoughts until the end. In many ways, he lived more like a retired academic than a former emperor. He was also deeply affected by the loss of Brazil. While he accepted the legitimacy of the Republic, he carried with him a quiet sadness. He missed the people, the landscapes, and the culture that had become his life's purpose. Letters from Brazil brought him joy, but also melancholy. He asked friends to send him Brazilian newspapers, coffee, and books in Portuguese. Though he had ruled a vast empire, his life in exile was defined by small personal gestures that kept him connected to the land he had loved. His health, already weakened before his departure, began to decline steadily. The emotional weight of exile, combined with recurring respiratory issues, took a toll on his body. In December of 1891, while staying in Paris, he contracted pneumonia. His condition worsened rapidly, and on December 5th of that year, Dom Pedro the Second passed away at the age of 66. His final words were said to have been simple: "May God grant me peace." He died not as an emperor, but as a private citizen in a foreign land, far from the country he had served for most of his life. News of his death reached Brazil quickly and sparked an unexpected outpouring of grief. Though the Republic was still consolidating its power and had expelled the imperial family, the Brazilian people, particularly those who had lived through his reign, reacted with deep respect. Newspapers, even those aligned with the new regime, published tributes to the former emperor. Editorials praised his wisdom, integrity, and personal modesty. Political opponents who had once called for the end of the monarchy now acknowledged his contributions to national unity and development. His body was initially interred in Lisbon, in the royal pantheon of the House of Braganza. But decades later, as Brazil began to reassess its imperial past, there was growing public support for repatriating his remains. In 1921, 30 years after his death, the Brazilian government authorized the return of the emperor's remains to Brazil. His reburial in the Cathedral of Petropolis was marked by solemn ceremonies, military honors, and a national moment of reflection. The decades following Dom Pedro II's death witnessed a gradual shift in how Brazilians remembered him. Initially, the Republic had sought to erase imperial symbols and narratives, presenting the new system as a break from the past. However, over time, historians, writers, and the general public began to view the imperial era with more nuance. Dom Pedro II came to be seen not merely as a monarch, but as a symbol of continuity, stability, and ethical leadership. In contrast to many rulers of the age, Dom Pedro had ruled with restraint. He had expanded education, promoted science, defended civil liberties, and avoided the kinds of excesses and abuses common among autocrats of the 19th century. His decision to step aside peacefully, without calling for resistance or foreign intervention, further cemented his image as a dignified and principled leader. In the early 20th century, statues were erected in his honor. His portraits returned to public buildings and textbooks. A monarchist movement emerged, not large enough to challenge the Republic, but influential enough to preserve the memory of the empire as a respected chapter in Brazilian history. His legacy became part of a broader national conversation about governance, identity, and leadership. In times of political instability, many Brazilians would look back to Dom Pedro II as a figure who embodied the values of duty, justice, and intellectual curiosity. His long reign, though ultimately ended by forces beyond his control, remained a touchstone for understanding Brazil's evolution from colony to empire to republic. With the fall of the Brazilian monarchy in 1889 and the quiet passing of Dom Pedro II 2 years later, the chapter of the empire came to a formal end. However, the influence of the imperial era did not vanish with the abdication or exile of the royal family. In many ways, the institutions, values, and national identity forged during the time of the empire continued to shape Brazilian society, politics, and self-understanding well into the Republican era. One of the most enduring legacies of the Empire of Brazil was the establishment of a unified national state. When Dom Pedro I declared independence in 1822, Brazil emerged from colonial rule as a single, cohesive political entity, a rarity in Latin America. Unlike the Spanish colonies, which fractured into multiple republics, Brazil maintained its territorial integrity throughout the 19th century, in large part due to the centralizing role of the monarchy. This unity was not accidental. The imperial government worked deliberately to hold the vast and diverse provinces of Brazil together through a strong administrative structure. The moderating power exercised by the monarch allowed the crown to intervene in political disputes and ensure the continuation of government during moments of crisis. While this centralization sometimes led to tensions with regional leaders, it also prevented prolonged civil wars and deep fragmentation. The legacy of institutional continuity extended into the early Republican period. Many of the legal frameworks, civil codes, and administrative practices developed under the empire were preserved or only lightly modified by the Republic. For example, the judiciary system, composed of provincial courts and a national Supreme Court, was originally designed during the imperial era. Even the structure of Brazil's bicameral legislature, with a Senate and Chamber of Deputies, had its origins in the constitutional monarchy and survived the transition to republican governance. Education, another hallmark of the imperial era, also left a lasting imprint. Though limited in scope and access, the empire had laid the groundwork for a modern educational system. The creation of secondary schools, teacher training institutes, and law faculties during Dom Pedro the Second's reign began to bear fruit in the early 20th century. The graduates of these institutions filled positions in the civil service, judiciary, and press, helping to professionalize Brazil's bureaucracy and expand the intellectual foundations of the republic. Culturally, the imperial period fostered a sense of national identity rooted in diversity and gradual synthesis. Brazil's geography, ethnic composition, and colonial history posed challenges to national cohesion. Yet through literature, the press, and state-sponsored cultural institutions, the empire promoted the idea of Brazil as a single multicultural nation. Romantic writers of the mid-19th century, many of whom received state support, celebrated indigenous heritage, African cultural influence, and regional folklore as uniquely Brazilian attributes. The monarchy itself, particularly under Dom Pedro the Second, became a symbol of moderation and stability. His personal commitment to intellectual life, public service, and institutional reform left an impression on the political culture. Even in Republican Brazil, politicians and thinkers continued to reference the emperor's legacy as a model for ethical governance. His respect for civil liberties, his opposition to authoritarianism, and his diplomatic skill earned him admiration across ideological lines. The abolition of slavery, though incomplete in its aftermath, was also a critical legacy of the empire. The long and difficult path to emancipation culminated during the imperial period, and while the Golden Law was not followed by meaningful reparations or social programs, it marked a turning point in Brazilian society. It laid the foundation for ongoing debates about race, citizenship, and social justice that would continue into the 20th and 21st centuries. In the realm of foreign policy, the empire had also established a pattern of regional diplomacy and restrained interventionism. Brazil's involvement in the Platine region, its participation in the Paraguayan War, and its ability to manage international relations with European powers demonstrated a capacity for strategic engagement. These patterns influenced how the Brazilian Republic positioned itself in the global arena, often favoring diplomacy, neutrality, and balance over ideological confrontation. Another important institutional legacy was the professionalization of the military. Though tensions between the armed forces and the monarchy contributed to the empire's fall, the foundations of a modern army had been laid during imperial times. The military academies, training protocols, and emphasis on merit over patronage began to define the officer corps. This professionalization had long-term effects on Brazilian political life, as the military would remain a powerful actor in the republic, both as a guardian of order and, at times, as a direct political force. The imperial court and royal family, even in exile, continued to symbolize a cultural heritage that many Brazilians viewed with nostalgia. While monarchist sentiment never regained political dominance, it persisted as a current in national memory. Public spaces named after emperors, statues in town squares, and the continued celebration of imperial holidays reflected the empire's enduring presence in the cultural landscape. In architecture and urban planning, The empire left its mark through the construction of civic buildings, churches, palaces, and infrastructure projects that defined the look of 19th century Brazilian cities. From the imperial palaces of Rio de Janeiro to the railway stations that connected the coffee-producing regions to the ports, these physical structures were reminders of a period of rapid development and state building. The social contract of the empire, rooted in gradual reform, patronage networks, and elite negotiation, also influenced political behavior in the early Republican era. Although the empire had excluded most Brazilians from political power, it had created mechanisms for elite consensus and legal continuity. These mechanisms, including the reliance on compromise, bureaucracy, and moderation, carried over into the new system and helped prevent more radical breaks with the past. Yet, the limitations of the empire's legacy must also be acknowledged. The centralized model left little space for participatory democracy. The failure to integrate formerly enslaved populations into full citizenship sowed the seeds of deep inequality. The emphasis on order over social justice and on progress without redistribution left structural challenges that the Republic struggled to address. Still, the imprint of the imperial era remains embedded in Brazilian institutions, national symbols, and political traditions. The flag's green and yellow colors, though redesigned, still reflect the imperial house's legacy. The national anthem, composed during the monarchy, remains the same, and the language of moderation, unity, and development continues to echo through Brazilian political discourse. Though the Brazilian monarchy formally ended with the proclamation of the Republic in 1889, it never fully disappeared from the national consciousness. Over the following decades, monarchist thought and nostalgia persisted across multiple generations, shaping political discourse, inspiring organized movements, and influencing cultural memory. While the monarchy never returned as a system of government, the legacy of Imperial Brazil continued to occupy a complex space in the nation's imagination, part history, part myth, and part political possibility. The first expressions of monarchist sentiment after the fall of the empire came from loyalists who had supported Dom Pedro the Second during his reign. Many of these individuals were members of the former aristocracy, civil servants, clergy, and military officers who felt alienated by the new Republican regime. For them, the empire had represented stability, continuity, and order. In contrast, the early republic was marked by political turbulence, elite factionalism, and a lack of clear constitutional guidance. These early monarchists tended to focus their efforts on preserving the cultural and moral legacy of the imperial period. They published memoirs, founded commemorative associations, and lobbied for the recognition of Dom Pedro the Second as a national hero. The reburial of the emperor's remains in Brazil in the early 20th century was a significant moment for this community, transforming the imperial legacy into a more accepted part of the country's historical narrative. As Brazil transitioned through its first republican decades, monarchism evolved into an organized political ideology. By the early 20th century, monarchist circles had begun to coalesce into formal movements. These groups were small and politically marginal, but they maintained a presence in newspapers, literary journals, and Catholic intellectual circles. Their arguments centered on the virtues of constitutional monarchy as a system that could provide unity, moral guidance, and protection from the excesses of partisan politics. These ideas gained occasional traction during periods of political instability. For instance, during the Vargas era in the mid-20th century, when Brazil experienced dictatorship, state control of the press, and suspended civil liberties, some intellectuals and public figures looked back to the empire with nostalgia. They contrasted the authoritarian tendencies of modern republican leaders with the image of Dom Pedro II as a moderate and enlightened monarch. Religious institutions also played a key role in keeping monarchist sentiment alive. The Catholic Church, which had lost some of its privileges under the secular republic, remained sympathetic to the memory of the empire. Clergy and lay organizations often portrayed the imperial family, particularly Princess Isabel, as defenders of Christian morality and social order. Isabel's signing of the Golden Law was reinterpreted by some as an act of spiritual courage, and she was sometimes depicted in religious literature as a saintly figure. In the post-World War periods, monarchist ideas continued to circulate among conservative intellectuals, especially those critical of Brazil's rapid modernization, industrialization, and urbanization. To these thinkers, the empire represented a more harmonious social order, one grounded in hierarchy, tradition, and cultural refinement. Publications romanticized imperial architecture, art, and etiquette, suggesting that Republican Brazil had lost touch with its deeper roots. The imperial family itself, though no longer politically active in the early 20th century, continued to play a symbolic role. After the banishment was lifted in the 1920s, members of the House of Orleans-Braganza, descendants of Dom Pedro II, were allowed to return to Brazil. They received polite public interest and occasional attention in the press, but they refrained from overt political activity. Over time, they came to be seen more as cultural figures than political actors. Monarchist political activism, however, experienced a moment of resurgence in the late 20th century. As Brazil emerged from a military dictatorship in the 1980s and prepared to draft a new democratic constitution, debates about the structure of government re-emerged. Some Brazilians, disillusioned with decades of authoritarianism and political corruption, began to ask whether a return to constitutional monarchy might offer a more balanced and stable alternative. This discussion reached its peak in 1993, when the new Brazilian constitution mandated a plebiscite to determine the form and system of government. The people were asked to vote not only between a presidential or parliamentary system, but also between a republic and a monarchy. This national referendum offered the first formal opportunity in over a century for monarchists to present their case to the electorate. In preparation for the vote, monarchist organizations mounted a public campaign. They promoted the memory of the imperial era, emphasized the figure of Dom Pedro II, and argued that constitutional monarchy provided checks on political excess while preserving democratic institutions. The modern descendants of the imperial family, though not officially campaigning, were featured in media coverage and offered statements of support. Despite the visibility of the campaign, the monarchist option was decisively defeated. The majority of Brazilians voted to retain the republican system. Nevertheless, the plebiscite rekindled national interest in Brazil's monarchical past and demonstrated that monarchism, while a minority view, remained part of the country's political imagination. In the years that followed, monarchist movements shifted their focus toward cultural preservation, education, and symbolic representation. Organizations such as the Brazilian Monarchist League and the Imperial Circle of Brazil continued to operate, promoting historical awareness and hosting ceremonial events. They argued for the importance of remembering Brazil's imperial heritage not as nostalgia for authoritarianism, but as a legacy of national unity and identity. The Brazilian media, especially television and film, also contributed to the reappraisal of the imperial era. Dramatizations of Dom Pedro the First's independent struggle, the life of Dom Pedro the Second, and Princess Isabel's role in abolition became popular among audiences. These portrayals often emphasized the human side of the imperial family, their virtues, their contradictions, and their connection to the broader currents of Brazilian history. In educational curricula, the imperial period regained prominence as historians moved away from simplistic narratives of republican triumph. Scholars began exploring the complexities of the monarchy's political system, its cultural development, and its role in shaping Brazil's long-term institutional framework. Academic studies of the empire, once rare, became more nuanced and widespread. Today, monarchism in Brazil exists primarily as a cultural and philosophical current rather than an active political movement. While there are still individuals and groups who advocate for a return to the monarchy, they are few in number and hold no significant influence over national policy. Their role is more commemorative than transformative, keepers of a memory that continues to inspire reflection. Yet the endurance of monarchism in Brazilian public life speaks to something deeper, a longing for dignity in governance, for stability amid change, and for a sense of continuity in a country often marked by rapid shifts and social upheaval. The empire may be gone, but its echoes remain. In architecture, in symbols, in historical consciousness, and in the belief that the past can still offer lessons for the future. When viewed within the broader context of Latin American and global history, the Empire of Brazil stands as a singular case. It was the only monarchy in the Americas to survive beyond the initial years of independence, and it lasted for nearly 7 decades. Unlike the many republics that emerged from the former Spanish colonies, Brazil chose, and for a long time maintained, a system centered on constitutional monarchy, gradual reform, and relative political stability. The legacy of this imperial century is complex, but understanding it provides essential insight into Brazil's long journey toward modern nationhood. One of the most striking aspects of the Brazilian Empire was its geographic unity. While the Spanish colonies in the Americas fractured into numerous republics, each shaped by local allegiances, regional conflicts, and colonial administrative divisions, Brazil emerged from Portuguese rule as a single, vast, and cohesive political entity. The presence of the Portuguese royal family in Rio de Janeiro during the early 19th century gave Brazil not only legitimacy but also a centralized seat of government from the outset of its independence. This unity had enduring consequences. It allowed the empire to develop common institutions, a national identity, and shared legal and administrative frameworks. While other Latin American countries were frequently beset by civil wars, shifting borders, and political fragmentation, Brazil was largely able to avoid disintegration. The monarchy, with its moderating power and symbolic authority, played a central role in managing this cohesion. Brazil's approach to political development was also distinct. Where many of its neighbors saw rapid, often violent shifts between liberal and conservative regimes, military coups, and cycles of authoritarianism, Brazil's imperial system was grounded in gradualism. While far from democratic by modern standards, voting was limited by literacy and property requirements, it nevertheless maintained a functioning constitutional structure for most of its existence. Power alternated between parties, a national legislature debated laws, and a professional bureaucracy expanded. This relative institutional continuity offered a foundation for modernization. During the reign of Dom Pedro the Second, Brazil made significant investments in infrastructure, including railroads, telegraph lines, and ports. Education and the sciences received support from the crown, and Brazil began to develop cultural institutions that fostered literature, music, and historical research. These efforts gave the country a stronger administrative and cultural identity than many of its republican counterparts. However, this same system also carried limitations. The empire's centralizing impulse, while effective in maintaining territorial integrity, often suppressed local autonomy and stifled broader political participation. Regional grievances, particularly during the Regency years and later in the southern provinces, revealed the limits of imperial authority and the persistence of localism. Perhaps the greatest contradiction of the Brazilian Empire was its dependence on slavery. While it presented itself as an enlightened and progressive monarchy, Brazil remained, until the final decade of the 19th century, one of the largest slave-holding societies in the world. This reliance on enslaved labor underpinned much of its economic growth, especially in the coffee-producing Southeast, and it delayed the development of a truly inclusive civil society. The eventual abolition of slavery in 1888, though a landmark achievement, came late compared to other nations in the Western Hemisphere, and it came without substantial planning for social integration or economic transition. The empire's hesitancy to challenge entrenched interests reflected the conservatism of its political elite and the structural compromises that had long defined its rule. This contradiction between reformist rhetoric and conservative practice ultimately weakened the monarchy. By the time the empire acted decisively to end slavery, it had already alienated many of its traditional supporters without building a strong new base. The Republican movement, bolstered by rising military influence and dissatisfaction with imperial inaction, was able to exploit this disaffection and engineer the monarchy's downfall with surprising ease. Yet despite its peaceful end, the Brazilian monarchy left behind a durable institutional legacy. Many of the structures built during the imperial period were carried into the Republic. Legal codes, state bureaucracies, educational institutions, and national symbols continued to reflect the formative influence of the empire. Even the flag of the Republic retained the imperial green and yellow, representing continuity as much as change. In historical comparison, Brazil's imperial century reveals both the strengths and the limitations of moderate constitutional monarchy as a framework for state building in a post-colonial context. The system offered stability and gradual progress, but was often slow to respond to social inequality, economic transformation, and rising democratic demands. What distinguished Brazil's path was not merely the presence of a monarch, but the nature of its political culture. The empire functioned less as an autocracy and more as a negotiated order among elites, planters, politicians, clergy, and the military, managed by a monarch who increasingly saw his role as that of a stabilizing, unifying figure. Dom Pedro the Second, in particular, embodied the image of a ruler who valued learning, respected constitutional limits, and sought to govern with restraint. This model had advantages. It allowed Brazil to maintain order during times of upheaval elsewhere in the region. It nurtured a growing national bureaucracy and a culture of civil debate, but it also came at a cost. By failing to democratize more fully or integrate the broader population into political life, the empire left unresolved tensions that would persist into the Republican era. In terms of global history, the Brazilian Empire also occupies a unique space. It was one of the few constitutional monarchies in the global south during the 19th century, and it lasted far longer than many expected. In a world increasingly dominated by republican and nationalist movements, Brazil's monarchy was a reminder of the flexibility of political forms, how a monarchy could coexist with parliamentarianism, modern economics, and cultural pluralism. As the 20th century unfolded, Brazil would face new challenges: dictatorship, industrialization, democratization, and inequality. But the imprint of the empire remained. Streets and cities continued to bear the names of emperors and imperial figures. The image of Dom Pedro the Second, once dismissed by Republicans, re-emerged as a symbol of dignified governance. Debates about national character, social reform, and constitutional design continued to reference the imperial experience. In reflecting on Brazil's imperial century, historians and citizens alike are reminded that the past is never simply buried. It is carried forward in institutions, in collective memory, and in the values that societies choose to preserve. The Empire of Brazil, with all its contradictions and achievements, remains a central chapter in the country's long and unfinished story. This is the legacy of the Brazilian Empire, a nation carved from colonial rule, not through violent revolution, but through the presence of a crown, a country that chose moderation when others chose rupture, and a people who, even after monarchy had passed into history, continued to debate, remember, and rediscover what it meant to be shaped by an empire.